I'm John Batchelor. Good evening. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor, joins me because there's big trouble in Big China. The trouble is financial right now. The poor numbers from the trade have left to the poor numbers in the stock market, following years of poor numbers or declining numbers in the real estate market after the bubble. But now the world is paying attention because of the roiling of the markets in Europe and the United States. We're not going to start with markets tonight. We'll get to them soon enough. We're going to start to speak of the aggression that China, the troubled and underperforming economy of China in the hands of Xi Jinping, an aggressive Maoist-like boss, that aggression towards the region. The admiral of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, his name is Scott Swift, recently commenting on this aggression, saying that he regards the Great Wall of Sand that's being built in the South China Sea as creating angst throughout the region. That is one explanation for the admiral visiting Australia and reassuring our allies. But Gordon has identified a positive outcome from the aggression in the South China Sea and the East China Sea against the Chinese neighbors. Gordon, a very good evening to you. What is the positive outcome?
The positive outcome is that countries in the region with the United States are now working cooperatively, trying to basically develop relationships that should have been put in place long ago, but now are actually being implemented. So what you have is the region banding together to protect itself.
We welcome our colleague Scott Harold, who's a full political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He is Deputy Director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy. Scott, a very good evening to you. Is this unanticipated that a region of so many different backgrounds and histories and cross purposes, and even 70 years ago, war fighting, would come together over Chinese aggression? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John, Gordon, and your listeners around the world. In some ways, John, this is exactly what international relations theorists would predict. Doesn't really matter what kind of a government you have. It doesn't really matter what kind of negative history you've had in the past. Countries have interests, and they have to get beyond their histories, and they have to look beyond whether or not they like the regime next door. The real question is, do I feel a threat? And if I feel a threat, I'm going to look aside at the human rights practices or the past negative history, and I will work with you if I think that you're going to help protect me from a common threat. In this case, China, which would like to believe that the rest of the region hates and has not forgotten about Japanese aggression 70-plus years ago, has been surprised by the fact that countries that suffered from that aggression, like the Philippines, like Australia, are perfectly comfortable setting that aside and focusing on their present community of shared interests as well as their community of shared values with the Japanese. Similarly, countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia are also looking at what China is doing in the South China Seas and what it has in the past done in the East China Seas, and saying, this is not where we are now. You are outside of the regional norms. We have to say to you, we are standing together collectively to do things like train and exercise together, purchase arms from each other or co-develop arms, stand together diplomatically and politically in regional forums like ASEAN. So in some sense, the Chinese have been a bit wrong-footed by this, and I think Admiral Swift is very much right to put his finger on this and highlight that the countries of the region are standing together and saying to China, what you are doing is not acceptable.
On September 3, Scott, as you know, Beijing will be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. There'll be a very large military parade through the center of Beijing, and really very few senior leaders from the region will be in attendance on that day. You talk about the Japanese, and what's interesting, I think, is that in June, you had a Japanese patrol plane take off from the Philippines, circle around Reed Bank, which both the Philippines and China claims, and it actually had on board 3 Philippine military advisors. And the Japanese are now participating in the Talisman exercises in Australia with the United States and the Australians. This really seems to be a region that is very different from 70 years ago. ago. And even a region's very different from 5 years ago when the Japanese were not participating as closely with countries that are its neighbors.
No, absolutely right, Gordon. What we're seeing in Japan has been a very substantial shift among the political elite's consciousness of the challenges that country faces. You know, they traditionally had been fairly low-key, understated security policy actors. But what Japan has now, I think, come to realize is that Japan supports and benefits from a very strong rule of law, international order system in East Asia. It's one that the United States has set up and helped support, and it's one that Japan actively wants to support because it sees that that's the only way to counter China's increasingly assertive or even aggressive posture towards the East China Sea and South China Sea issues, is by standing with other countries with which it shares interests and values in common.
You know, it's interesting because you would think that Beijing would see all of this and would sort of pull back and try to break up the coalition that is now forming. But as John mentioned when he started out this segment, he talked about the 2 live fire exercises that the People's Liberation Army conducted over the last 3 or 4 weeks. This seems to me to be something which is really not designed to break the coalition apart, but to basically drive it together. I don't understand this.
You know, Gordon, one thing it's worth bearing in mind is that even one-party dictatorships like China have domestic politics, and while from the outside it's very tempting sometimes to look at China as a unified whole, a very powerful rising country with extremely expansive ambitions, it's also worth remembering that as China is rising and now beginning to encounter pushback, all of that is happening at the very same time as internally China is racked by its most severe political crisis in probably 25 to 30 years, with Xi Jinping going after all of the toughest guys who are in that political system on charges of corruption. Remember, he's gone after not just state-owned enterprise leaders, but intelligence sector leaders. He's gone after the Ministry of State Security. He's gone after his rivals in the PLA itself. And at the top of this heap is widely suspected to be 2 former leaders, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, both of whom he wants to send to a very clear signal: stay out of politics, stay on the sidelines, stay retired, I'm running things now. And in that environment, one thing that I think anyone who is smart would do would be to make sure that they look like the toughest SOB on the block. I'm not soft on the Japanese, I'm not soft on the Filipinos, I'm not soft on the Taiwanese, and I'm not soft on the Americans, because you don't want to give any of your rivals a chance to run to your right on national security questions and paint you as too weak to be leading the country.
We have 30 seconds, Scott, and I think I hear you correctly that there is no anticipated climb down. Xi Jinping will continue to be aggressive. Is that what you're predicting?
Well, I would certainly predict that between now and when he visits Washington, the Chinese will try to put as much happy talk in their press about how relations with the United States are going well, and how the cyber attacks are not real or cannot accurately be attributed to China, and how China has stopped building islands in the South China Sea. Of course, they've stopped building islands, but now they're beginning to turn those into facilities that they can actually use for power projection. So I think it's going to behoove all of us to keep a very close eye on what's actually happening and not pay too much attention to the happy talk designed to ensure that the summit goes off well.
Scott Harold of the RAND Corporation, Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor. I'm John Batchelor.